Thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm going to talk about some of the science policy interface research that we are doing about how people understand the probabilistic information that is communicated from the scientific models. Like, so there is 30% chance of rain tomorrow. How would you incorporate that in their decision making, but also whether information is likely or not likely? So we're trying to understand the spatial scale, political ideology, or other kinds of factors that affect people's understanding of probabilistic information. And to do that, this is funded by a larger NSFC Think project. This is one of the specific studies that we implemented in Vermont through an experimental survey. That's a 2x2 experimental survey that was implemented in 2010 and 2012. And so the questions that we posed to about 600 people who responded in 20% response rate was on this side. The climate change experts predict that there is a 20% chance that annual snowfall in Vermont will be half of its historical levels by 2020. So this 20% chance, how do people translate that? And we gave them the IPCC criteria, starting from extremely unlikely to very unlikely to unlikely. And the correct response would be unlikely, but what we found was that about even 5% of the people think that 20% is like virtually uncertain to happen, or very likely. So it's like we try to then use this data to estimate who is overestimating the probability and who's underestimating the probability. And similarly, in the experiment, we also gave them the half of the sample was split, and we gave them the unlikely, same question with unlikely instead of 20%, and gave them the actual numbers, which are written on the x-axis of the second graph. And we see that the patterns are very different from verbal to numerical versus numerical to verbal translations. We also gave them the questions, similarly, the people who gave the numerical to verbal answers, we also gave them a remote scale question with asking this. Climate change experts predict that there is an 80% chance that half of the coral reefs around the world will disappear by 2020. So the correct answer in this case was likely, but we see that a lot of people are underestimating the probability or underestimating the risk that's communicated in that information. So we use these estimations not only in the IPCC criteria, but also using standardized standard deviation measures away from the mean probability distribution function. So we use two dependent variables to calculate our regression models, which basically there are 4 regression models. And one important point that I want to make about this is that we collected, it was a randomly sampled survey across the Vermont, but it was oversampled for the women, so we used the 2010 sample census data to use the frequency weights to estimate weighted regression models. And what we find is that, consistent with the previous research, that, for example, gender effects, females typically tend to be overestimating. They're more concerned about the risk. They typically, in the previous studies, but what we find in this case is that the females, when there are positive values on the coefficients, that means that they're overestimating, and when there are negative values, it means they're underestimating. That when we talk about effects which are closer, like local scale effects, females are overly concerned and overestimate. Similarly, the political ideology effects are very clear that progressives always overestimate by a large margin. Republicans underestimate. And then we find that there is a strong evidence for anchoring and adjustment heuristic. My co-authors helped me geocode the data by towns. And we isolated the towns that were affected by Irene. And what we find was that, contrary to the previous research, that experience of disastrous events affects people and raises makes them more alarmist. What we find is that the risk of the people who live in disaster-prone areas or risk-prone areas is higher. So that suggests that the anchoring and adjustment heuristic is better to fit in these kind of large-scale risk perception models as opposed to the impacts of experience, and that leads to higher risk. So thank you very much.